Welcome to Betrayed Hearts Chronicles. The afternoon sun poured through the wide bay windows of the living room, casting a golden glow on the freshly polished hardwood floors. I adjusted the throw pillows on the couch for the third time, sighing as I glanced around the room. Everything had to be perfect. After all, hosting an exchange student from another country wasn't just an honor, it was a responsibility. Or so Greg had reminded me, repeatedly. It's not like Luca will care if the couch pillows match, I muttered to myself, brushing an errant strand of hair from my face. Talking to yourself again? Greg's voice floated in from the kitchen, a faint edge of amusement in his tone. I rolled my eyes but didn't respond. Greg was always too busy to notice the effort I put into things like this, too preoccupied with his work to see how much I craved his approval. But this hosting Luca was his idea, part of some cultural exchange program his company sponsored. It'll be fun, he'd said. He's young, energetic, a breath of fresh air around the house. Young, energetic, fresh air. Words that felt foreign in my life these days. The doorbell rang, and my heart jumped. Wiping my hands on my jeans, I hurried to the door, nerves fluttering in my stomach. I swung it open to find him standing there, suitcase in hand. Luca. He was taller than I expected, with tousled dark hair that looked as though it had been kissed by the Mediterranean sun. His tan skin contrasted with his white button-up shirt, which was slightly wrinkled but effortlessly stylish. Then there were his eyes, hazel with flecks of gold, so warm and inviting that for a moment, I forgot how to speak. Signora Rachel? His voice carried a soft accent, melodic and rich, the kind that could make even the simplest words sound like poetry. I blinked, realizing I was staring. Yes, that's me. But please just call me Rachel. Come in, come in. He stepped inside, his movements fluid, graceful. As he set his suitcase by the stairs, he smiled. A smile so genuine and disarming that I felt my cheeks flush. It's beautiful here, he said, his gaze sweeping the room. Grazie mille for having me. Oh, it's no trouble at all, I replied, waving a hand as if I hadn't spent hours scrubbing every surface of the house. Greg appeared then, shaking Luca's hand firmly and launching into his usual charm routine. Welcome, Luca. We're thrilled to have you. How was your flight? As they chatted, I couldn't help but study Luca more closely. He was younger than I'd expected, just 22, Greg had said, but there was a quiet confidence about him that made him seem older. And then there was the way he smiled, how his eyes crinkled at the corners, the way he leaned forward as if every word mattered. Dinner that evening was a modest affair. Roast chicken, a salad, and a loaf of crusty bread I'd baked that morning. Luca complimented everything, his praise genuine, his enthusiasm infectious. Greg reveled in playing the host, asking Luca about his hometown, his family, his plans for his time in the States. I mostly listened, watching the way Luca gestured as he spoke, his hands dancing through the air, his accent wrapping itself around every word. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen someone so alive. Later, as I cleared the table, Luca insisted on helping. Really, you don't have to, I said, stacking plates. Nonsense, he replied, grabbing a dishcloth. You cooked. Clean. It's only fair. We stood side by side at the sink, the warm, soapy water splashing between us. I handed him a plate to dry, and for a moment our fingers brushed. It was fleeting, innocent, but it sent a small jolt through me. Thank you for everything, he said softly, glancing at me. I already feel at home here. You're welcome, I managed, my voice catching. That night, as I lay in bed beside Greg, who was already snoring softly, I stared at the ceiling, replaying the events of the evening. It was silly, I told myself. Luca was just being polite, charming in that way Europeans often were. And yet, I couldn't shake the memory of his smile, the warmth of his voice, the way he'd said my name. Rachel. Just a name. Just a word. But as the hours ticked by, I realized it was the first time in years I'd felt truly seen. The following week brought a new rhythm to the house. Mornings were filled with the sound of Luca humming in the kitchen, his accent curling around cheerful greetings, as he poured espresso into delicate cups he'd insisted on buying for us. Greg, always rushing out the door for work, barely noticed the subtle changes. But I noticed everything. One afternoon, after dropping my daughter off at a friend's house, I returned home to find Luca sitting cross-legged on the living room floor. He was sketching in a notebook, the sunlight streaming through the window onto his face, softening his sharp features. "You're an artist?" I asked, setting my purse down. He looked up, his face lighting with that effortless smile. "Not a professional. It's just something I love to do." Curious, I walked closer and leaned over to see. The sketch was stunning. An intricate portrait of a young woman sitting beneath a tree, her expression serene yet wistful. I couldn't help but admire the delicate strokes, the way he captured emotion in every line. "It's beautiful," I said softly. "Grazie," he replied, his gaze shifting to meet mine. I had a great view. For a moment, I didn't understand what he meant, but then I noticed how his eyes lingered on my face. My cheeks flushed, and I straightened abruptly. I should start dinner," I stammered, heading to the kitchen without looking back. Over the next few days, the air between us grew thicker, heavier. It wasn't anything overt, just subtle moments, like the way his gaze seemed to find me no matter where I was in the room, or the way his voice softened when he spoke my name. One evening, as I stood outside watering the garden, Luca stepped out of the house, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his jeans. "Do you always take care of this alone?" he asked, gesturing to the flower beds. "Greg isn't much of a gardener," I replied, my voice tinged with sarcasm. Luca crouched beside me, studying the roses I'd been pruning. "They're beautiful," he said, "but I think they need more space to breathe." I raised an eyebrow. "You're a gardening expert now?" He grinned, a playful glint in his eye. "In Italy, I worked at my uncle's vineyard every summer. I learned a little about nurturing plants and people." There was a pause, the air crackling with unspoken words. I realized how close we were, his knee nearly brushing mine as he crouched there. My breath caught as he reached out, gently brushing a petal with his fingers. "They deserve attention," he murmured. "Care. Otherwise, they wither." His words hung between us, heavy with a meaning I didn't dare acknowledge. The next day, Greg announced he'd be working late. Again. Dinner was quieter than usual with just Luca and me at the table. He asked me about my life before marriage, a question that startled me with its simplicity. I used to teach," I said, twisting my napkin in my lap. "English literature. But I stopped when the kids were born." "You loved it, didn't you?" he asked, his eyes piercing through me. "Yes," I admitted, feeling a pang of something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Regret. "So why stop?" The question caught me off guard, and I bristled. "Because life doesn't always go as planned. Responsibilities come first." Luca nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "But what about you, Rachel? Don't you deserve to live, too?" I opened my mouth to respond but couldn't find the words. The intensity of his gaze made my skin prickle, and I quickly rose to clear the table. But as I carried the dishes to the sink, I felt him behind me, his presence warm, magnetic. When I turned, he was standing there, closer than he should have been. "Luca," I began, but he interrupted. "Me despias," he said, his voice soft. "I don't mean to make you uncomfortable. It's just, you deserve to feel alive, Rachel." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The air between us felt too charged, too thick. Finally, I broke the tension, stepping around him to the sink. "You should get some rest," I said, forcing my voice to sound steady. But as he left the room, I couldn't ignore the way my heart raced, the way his words echoed in my mind. That night, I lay in bed wide awake, the stillness of the house pressing down on me. Greg was snoring softly beside me, oblivious to the storm brewing within me. Luca's words haunted me. They weren't just words. They were a challenge, a question, a promise of something I hadn't dared to imagine for myself. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to resist. The days passed slowly, each one tinged with an unspoken tension that seemed to coil tighter every time Luca and I were alone together. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was imagining the way his gaze lingered too long, the way his hand would brush against mine with just enough pressure to make my breath hitch. It was early one afternoon when the dam began to crack. The kitchen was alive with the warm scent of fresh basil and simmering marinara. I had decided to make lasagna for dinner, thinking it might be a small taste of home for Luca. He wandered in as I was layering the pasta sheets, his hair damp from a recent shower and curling at the edges. He wore a white t-shirt and sweatpants, simple yet impossibly attractive. "Lasagna?" he asked, his face lighting up. "You're spoiling me." I laughed, brushing a strand of hair from my face with the back of my hand. "I thought you might appreciate a little Italian comfort food." "Let me help," he offered, moving to stand beside me. "It's fine, really." But he was already reaching for the sauce ladle. No, I insist. You've done enough." We stood shoulder to shoulder at the counter, our movements unintentionally synchronized. I couldn't help but notice how close he was, the faint scent of his cologne mingling with the aroma of tomatoes and herbs. At one point, as I reached for a dish, his hand brushed mine. Just a glancing touch, soft and fleeting, but it was enough to send a shiver up my spine. "Sorry," he murmured, his voice low. "It's okay," I replied quickly, though my heart was pounding. For a moment, neither of us moved. His hand lingered near mine, his fingers brushing the back of my wrist. The warmth of his skin was intoxicating, and I couldn't seem to pull away. "Rachel," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked up at him, startled by the intensity in his eyes. My lips parted, but no words came out. The sound of the front door slamming broke the spell, and I stepped back abruptly, nearly knocking over the tray of lasagna. Greg's voice carried through the house, calling out a distracted greeting as he walked to his office. I turned back to the counter, my cheeks burning. Luca had already stepped away, his face unreadable as he began tidying up. Later that week, the accidental touches continued, each one more deliberate than the last. We were in the garden one morning, weeding the flower beds side by side. The sun was warm on my back, the earthy scent of soil filling the air. I reached for a trowel at the same time he did, our hands colliding. "Sorry," I said automatically, trying to pull away, but Luca didn't let go. Instead, his fingers curled lightly around mine, holding them in place. I looked up at him, startled, but he was watching me with a steady, unreadable expression. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite name. I should have pulled away. I should have said something, anything, to break the moment. But I didn't. I stayed frozen, my hand in his, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. After what felt like an eternity, he released me, the warmth of his touch lingering on my skin. That evening, as I folded laundry in the living room, Luca walked in, holding one of my daughter's school projects. "She left this in the dining room," he said, placing it on the coffee table. "Thanks," I replied, folding a t-shirt and setting it on the pile. He didn't leave. Instead, he sat on the couch, his posture relaxed but his gaze intent. "Do you ever miss your old life?" he asked suddenly. I paused, my hands stilling. "What do you mean?" "Before all this," he said, gesturing vaguely at the house. "Before the routines, the responsibilities. Before you stopped teaching." I swallowed hard, caught off guard by the question. I don't think about it much." "Maybe you should," he said, his voice gentle. I turned to look at him, unsure how to respond. There was something in his eyes, an understanding, a kind of knowing that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I allowed myself to wonder. When had I stopped dreaming? When had I started settling for less? That night, as I lay in bed beside Greg, my thoughts were consumed by Luca. His words, his touch, the way he looked at me as if I were the only person in the world. I tried to push the thoughts away, tried to focus on the steady rhythm of Greg's breathing. But it was no use, because deep down, I knew something had already begun, something I wasn't sure I could stop. Greg left early that Friday morning for a weekend work retreat. He'd mentioned it offhand the week before, like so many other things he thought didn't warrant discussion. Just a quick team-building trip, he'd said, kissing me distractedly before diving into his laptop. It was the kind of absence I used to dread, the long stretches of silence punctuated only by the kids' chatter or the hum of the dishwasher. But now, as I waved him off from the doorway, my heart thudded with anticipation instead of loneliness. Luca emerged from the kitchen shortly after, a mug of coffee in his hands and that signature easy smile on his lips. "Busy day planned?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes holding a spark of curiosity. I hesitated, searching for something mundane to say, but the words didn't come. Instead, I heard myself asking, "Would you like to go out today? I mean, explore the town." His brows lifted in surprise, but his grin widened. "I'd love to. Where should we go?" The day was warm, the kind of early autumn afternoon that felt like summer clinging desperately to its last breath. We walked through the bustling farmers' market downtown, weaving between stalls filled with fresh produce, baked goods, and handmade crafts. Luca's enthusiasm was contagious. He lingered at each stand, asking vendors about their work, their stories, his Italian accent drawing smiles and charmed responses from everyone he met. "Try this," he said, holding out a piece of honey-drizzled goat cheese he'd bought from a cheerful older woman. I leaned in, letting him place the morsel on my tongue. The sweetness of the honey mingled with the tang of the cheese, and I closed my eyes, savoring the taste. "Good, right?" he asked, his voice close to my ear. When I opened my eyes, he was watching me, his gaze steady and intense. My cheeks flushed, and I turned away, pretending to study a basket of peaches on the next table. After the market, we stopped at a small cafe on the edge of town, its patio shaded by sprawling oak trees. Over cappuccinos and shared slices of tiramisu, the conversation turned personal. "Why did you stop teaching?" Luca asked, his voice gentle but probing. I hesitated, tracing the rim of my coffee cup with my finger. It wasn't really a choice. Greg's job required us to move, and then the kids came along. Life got busy. "Busy," he repeated, the word heavy with unspoken meaning. "But do you miss it?" I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Every day." His hand reached across the table, resting lightly on mine. The gesture was simple, but it sent a jolt through me. I didn't pull away. "Rachel," he said softly, his eyes locking onto mine. "You deserve to have something that's yours, something that makes you happy." My breath caught, and for a moment I couldn't speak. The weight of his words settled deep in my chest, stirring something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. We wandered into a nearby park after lunch, the leaves beginning to turn gold and red around us. Children laughed in the distance, their voices carried on the breeze, but the world felt quiet, like it existed only for us. We stopped by the edge of a small pond, the water shimmering in the sunlight. Luca crouched to pick up a flat stone and skipped it across the surface, his movements fluid and boyish. "Do you ever do things just for fun?" he asked, straightening and turning to face me. "I don't think I remember how," I admitted, a small laugh escaping me. "Then let's start now," he said, his grin mischievous. Before I could protest, he grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the playground nearby. I laughed in earnest as he climbed onto the swings, his long legs looking almost comical as he pumped higher and higher. "Come on," he called, motioning for me to join him. Shaking my head but unable to resist, I sat on the swing beside him, my laughter blending with his as we soared back and forth, the cool wind rushing past us. For the first time in years I felt free. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, we returned home, the weight of reality creeping back in with every step. But instead of heading inside, Luca stopped me just outside the door. "Today was perfect," he said, his voice quiet. "Thank you." "It was," I agreed, smiling despite the ache building in my chest. He took a step closer, his hand brushing against mine. The warmth of his touch lingered, the small gesture igniting the tension that had been building between us for weeks. "Rachel?" His voice was barely a whisper now, and when I looked up at him, his face was so close, his eyes searching mine. My heart thundered in my chest, every logical thought screaming at me to step away. But I didn't. When his lips met mine, it was gentle at first, hesitant, as if he were testing the waters. Then the kiss deepened, his hands coming up to cradle my face, pulling me closer. I melted into him, my fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt as the rest of the world fell away. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless, my heart racing. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his forehead resting against mine. "I couldn't." "Don't," I whispered, cutting him off. "Don't apologize." Because in that moment I didn't want him to. The house was quiet that night, an unsettling stillness settling over the rooms as if the walls themselves held their breath. My children were asleep upstairs, and the faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the kitchen as I poured myself a glass of wine. My hands trembled slightly, the events of the day replaying in my mind with vivid clarity. Luca's touch, his kiss, the way he'd looked at me like I was the only person in the world. The rational part of me screamed to stop, to distance myself before this became something I couldn't take back. But that part was growing quieter, drowned out by a deep, restless longing I couldn't deny. Footsteps behind me broke my reverie, and I turned to find Luca standing in the doorway. He wore a simple gray t-shirt and dark jeans, his hair slightly tousled. He looked at me as if he could read every thought racing through my mind. "I couldn't sleep," he said softly, stepping into the room. "Me neither," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He gestured to the bottle of wine on the counter. "May I join you?" I nodded, wordlessly reaching for another glass. I poured for him, our hands brushing as I passed the glass over. The touch lingered, his fingers grazing mine just enough to send a jolt of electricity up my arm. We stood there for a moment, sipping in silence, the air between us crackling with unspoken words. Finally, Luca set his glass down and took a step closer. "Rachel," he said, his voice low and filled with emotion, "I can't pretend anymore. I can't stop thinking about you." I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain he could hear it. "Luca, I know it's wrong," he continued, his eyes searching mine. "I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I do, and I think you feel it too." I opened my mouth to respond, to deny, to push him away, but no words came. Instead, I set my glass down on the counter, my movements slow and deliberate. He took another step, his body so close now that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. His hand reached out, hesitating for a moment before brushing against my cheek. The tenderness in the gesture undid me. "I don't want to make you do anything you don't want," he said softly, his voice trembling. I looked up at him, my breath hitching as I whispered, "I don't want you to stop." The distance between us vanished in an instant. His lips crashed against mine with a fervor that sent my senses spiraling. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer as my fingers tangled in his hair. The kiss was desperate, a release of weeks of tension and suppressed desire. He lifted me onto the kitchen counter, his hands sliding up my thighs, his touch igniting a fire that spread through my entire body. I gasped as his lips trailed down my neck, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin there. "Luca?" I breathed, my voice barely audible. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine, his breath ragged. "Say the word, Rachel. Tell me to stop and I will." But I didn't. Instead, I pulled him closer, capturing his lips again as I wrapped my legs around his waist. We made our way to the living room, his hands never leaving my body. The world outside seemed to disappear as we sank onto the couch, the softness of the cushions a stark contrast to the urgency between us. His hands found the hem of my shirt, and he paused, his eyes meeting mine as if asking for permission. I nodded, helping him pull the fabric over my head. His gaze traveled over me, his admiration evident in the way his fingers traced the curve of my waist. "You're beautiful," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but in the best way. For the first time in years, I felt desired, truly, deeply desired. I tugged at his shirt, and he obliged, pulling it off to reveal the taut muscles of his chest. My hands roamed over him, exploring the planes of his body as his lips found mine again. Hours passed in a haze of passion and whispered confessions. We moved together like we'd done this 1,000 times before, yet every touch, every kiss, felt new and electrifying. When it was over, we lay tangled together on the couch, the room illuminated only by the soft glow of the moonlight streaming through the window. His fingers traced lazy patterns on my skin as I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "I never meant for this to happen," I whispered, the weight of what we'd done settling over me. "Neither did I," he replied, his voice gentle. "But I don't regret it." I lifted my head to look at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt. But all I saw was sincerity. "Do you?" he asked, his eyes filled with both hope and fear. I hesitated, the enormity of the question pressing down on me. Finally, I shook my head. "No, I don't." He smiled, his relief evident as he pulled me closer. But even as I lay there in his arms, a part of me knew the path we just stepped onto was one we could never turn back from. The days following that night were a blur, filled with stolen moments and whispered secrets. Each time I saw Luca, the memory of his touch and the intensity of our shared passion ignited a longing in me I couldn't contain. I knew it was reckless, that what we were doing could destroy everything, but the magnetic pull between us was impossible to resist. It started with small, calculated risks. When Greg left for work, Luca would find me in the kitchen, his hands sliding around my waist as I prepared breakfast. Sometimes we'd barely say a word, letting the closeness speak for us. Other times, we whispered fragments of conversation, moments of connection that grew deeper with every passing day. "Do you ever think about what you'd be doing if life had gone differently?" he asked one afternoon as we stood by the garden. "Sometimes," I admitted, plucking a stray weed from the soil. "But it's hard to imagine anything else when you've been living the same routine for years." His hand brushed against mine as he reached for the watering can. "Maybe it's time for something new." The afternoons became our sanctuary. When the kids were at school and Greg was at the office, Luca and I had the house to ourselves. It was during these hours that our connection deepened, our passion evolving into something more profound. One afternoon, as rain pattered softly against the windows, I found Luca in the living room, his sketchbook balanced on his lap. He looked up when I entered, his face lighting up with a smile that never failed to disarm me. "Come here," he said, patting the space beside him on the couch. I hesitated, glancing at the clock. "The kids will be home in an hour. We have time," he said, his voice low and coaxing. I sat beside him, and he turned the sketchbook to show me his latest drawing. It was a portrait of me, captured with an intimacy and detail that made my breath catch. "Luca," I whispered, my fingers grazing the edge of the paper. "It's beautiful." "It's you," he said simply, his gaze holding mine. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that quickly deepened, his sketchbook forgotten as it slid to the floor. Each meeting felt like a gamble, the thrill of being caught heightening the intensity of every touch, every kiss. We found moments wherever we could, hidden corners of the house, quiet drives through the countryside, even brief encounters in the shadowed stairwell while the kids played outside. But it wasn't just the physical connection that kept drawing me back to Luca. It was the way he made me feel alive, like I mattered in a way I hadn't felt in years. He listened to me, asked questions about my dreams and desires, and treated me as if I were the most important person in the world. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," he said one evening as we lay tangled together on the couch, the room bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. I hesitated, staring at the ceiling. "I used to dream about writing a book, a novel, but I gave up on it a long time ago." "Why?" "Because life got in the way. There was always something more important to focus on." He turned to me, his expression serious. "It's not too late, Rachel. You still have time to do the things you love." His words stayed with me long after he left the room. But the deeper our connection grew, the more difficult it became to keep our secret. Greg started noticing small changes in me. How distracted I seemed during dinner, how I lingered in the kitchen longer than usual. "You've been acting different lately?" he said one night as we cleaned up the dishes. "Is everything okay?" I forced a smile, my heart racing. "I'm fine. Just tired." He didn't seem convinced, but he let it go, turning his attention back to the stack of dishes in the sink. Even the kids began to notice something was different. "Mom, why do you smile so much when Luca's around?" my daughter asked one evening, her innocent eyes watching me closely. I froze, caught off guard by the question. "I'm just happy he's enjoying his time here," I said quickly, hoping the explanation would satisfy her. But deep down, I knew the facade was beginning to crack. The risk only made our stolen moments more exhilarating. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in the bedroom, Luca appeared in the doorway. "Do you ever take a break?" he teased, his voice low and playful. "Not when there's this much to do," I replied, holding up a neatly folded t-shirt. He stepped into the room, his presence immediately commanding my attention. "Let me help, then." Before I could protest, he was in front of me, his hands covering mine as he took the shirt from my grasp and set it aside. "Luca?" I began, but my voice faltered as he leaned closer, his lips brushing against the sensitive skin just below my ear. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his breath warm against my neck. I didn't. Instead, I let him guide me back against the bed, my protests silenced by the intensity of his kiss. As the weeks went on, the lines between right and wrong blurred further. I knew we couldn't keep going like this, that the danger of being caught was growing with every passing day. But I also knew I couldn't bring myself to let go, because for the first time in years I felt alive. The days had grown shorter, autumn's golden hues giving way to the gray chill of early November. The change in the seasons felt like a metaphor for my life. The warmth and comfort I'd once relied on replaced by a storm of emotions I could no longer control. Every moment with Luca was a stolen treasure, but the weight of what we were doing began to press on me. The exhilaration of secrecy was giving way to paranoia. Each shared glance, each quiet laugh behind closed doors, carried the risk of discovery. One Friday evening, Greg arrived home earlier than usual. I was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of pasta sauce, when I heard the unmistakable sound of his car in the driveway. My heart leapt into my throat. Luca was in the dining room, arranging the table with the kids. He'd been teasing them with stories about his life in Italy, his laughter filling the space as if he belonged there. Greg walked in, his expression tired but pleased. "Hey, everyone," he said, dropping his briefcase by the door. Luca looked up, smiling easily. "Greg, welcome back. Just in time for dinner." Greg nodded, his eyes sweeping over the scene. I saw the faint flicker of suspicion in his gaze as he watched Luca. "You're always so helpful around here," Greg said, his tone casual but laced with something I couldn't quite place. "It's my pleasure," Luca replied smoothly, his charm unwavering. But I felt Greg's eyes shift to me, questioning, as if he were piecing something together. That night, as we lay in bed, Greg's voice broke the silence. "Rachel, do you think Luca's been too comfortable here?" I froze, my pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "I don't know. He's just always around. Sometimes it feels like he's a little too close to you." I forced a laugh, hoping to deflect. "He's just a nice guy, Greg. He's trying to be polite and fit in." Greg didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Maybe. Just be careful, okay?" I nodded, turning away so he wouldn't see the panic in my eyes. The next day, Luca and I met in the garden. The kids were inside, and Greg had gone to run errands. "He's starting to suspect something," I said, my voice trembling. Luca stepped closer, his expression serious. "What did he say?" "Nothing concrete, but he's watching us. We need to be more careful." Luca reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. "I won't let anything happen to you, Rachel. I promise." I wanted to believe him, but the fear was growing harder to ignore. That weekend, the tension came to a boiling point. Greg announced that he'd invited the neighbors over for dinner, a casual gathering to catch up. I knew it was his way of observing Luca and me in a social setting, testing the waters for anything suspicious. As the evening wore on, I could feel Greg's eyes on me, tracking every interaction I had with Luca. I tried to focus on the conversation, laughing at the appropriate moments and keeping my distance from Luca as much as possible. But the strain was unbearable. Every glance felt like a spotlight, every smile like an admission of guilt. At one point, while refilling the wine glasses, I felt Luca's hand brush against mine. It was a fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt through me. I pulled away quickly, glancing around to see if anyone had noticed. Greg's gaze met mine from across the room. His expression was calm, but there was a coldness in his eyes that made my stomach churn. Later that night, as I cleaned up the dishes, Greg leaned against the counter, watching me. "You seemed a little distracted tonight," he said casually. I forced a smile, my hands trembling as I dried a plate. "Just tired, I guess. It's been a long week." He didn't sound convinced. The silence stretched between us, heavy and oppressive. Finally, he spoke again, his tone sharp. "Rachel, is there something going on I should know about?" I turned to him, my heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" "I don't know," he said, crossing his arms. "You tell me. You've been acting strange lately, and Luca seems a little too attached to you." My throat tightened, panic rising in my chest. "Greg, that's ridiculous. He's just being friendly. Don't read into things that aren't there." He stared at me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Maybe you're right, but I'm watching, Rachel. Don't think I'm not." The warning was clear, but it did little to deter Luca and me. If anything, the risk of being caught only heightened the intensity of our affair. One afternoon, while Greg was at work, Luca pulled me into the laundry room, his lips capturing mine in a desperate kiss. "Luca, we can't keep doing this," I whispered, even as my hands gripped his shirt, pulling him closer. "I can't stay away from you," he murmured against my lips. "I don't care about the risks. I need you, Rachel." His words sent a thrill through me, but they also filled me with dread. We were walking a tightrope, and I knew it was only a matter of time before we fell. It was a crisp Wednesday afternoon when the fragile web of secrecy began to unravel. I had just returned from the grocery store, the autumn chill clinging to my coat, when I noticed my daughter, Emily, sitting on the stairs with her phone in hand. Her face was pale, her expression tight with something I couldn't quite place. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, setting the bags on the counter. "Everything okay?" She didn't look up, her fingers gripping the phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Mom," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to talk to you." My stomach twisted, a sense of foreboding creeping over me. "What's wrong?" She hesitated, glancing at the screen before finally holding the phone out to me. I think Dad needs to see this." I froze as I took the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. The screen displayed a photo, a blurry, hastily snapped image of Luca and me. We were in the garden, his hands on my waist, our faces too close to be innocent. My mouth went dry. Where did you get this?" "Chloe's mom sent it to me," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She said someone saw you two at the market last week and followed you home. She thought I should know what's going on." Panic surged through me, and I struggled to keep my voice steady. "Emily, it's not what it looks like. Don't lie to me," she snapped, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm not a kid, Mom. I can see what's happening." The weight of her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I sank onto the stairs beside her, my hands trembling as I set the phone down. "Does Dad know?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Not yet," she said, wiping at her eyes. "But he's going to find out, isn't he?" I nodded, unable to meet her gaze. That evening, I paced the kitchen, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. Emily had retreated to her room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Luca entered quietly, his brow furrowed in concern. "What's wrong?" he asked, stepping closer. "They know," I said, my voice cracking. "Emily found out, and someone in the neighborhood is spreading rumors." He stiffened, his jaw tightening. "What are we going to do?" "I don't know," I whispered, tears threatening to spill. "Greg is going to find out. I can't stop it." Luca reached for me, pulling me into his arms. "We'll face it together," he said firmly. "No matter what happens, I'm here for you." But his words, as comforting as they were, did little to ease the crushing guilt and fear that consumed me. Greg came home late that night, his expression weary from another long day at the office. I stood in the kitchen, pretending to clean the counters as he set his briefcase down and poured himself a drink. "How was your day?" I asked, my voice unnaturally bright. "Fine," he replied, sipping his whiskey. "Yours?" "Good," I lied, avoiding his gaze. The silence stretched between us, heavy and oppressive. I could feel his eyes on me, studying me in that way he always did when he suspected something was off. Finally, he spoke. "Rachel, is there something you want to tell me?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I turned to him, my heart hammering in my chest. "No," I said, forcing a smile. "Why would you ask that?" He didn't respond immediately, his gaze narrowing. "Emily's been acting strange lately. Quiet, upset. She told me something earlier, something I wasn't sure I wanted to believe." The room seemed to tilt, the edges of my vision blurring. "What did she say?" Greg set his glass down with deliberate care, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "She said there's something going on between you and Luca." I opened my mouth to deny it, to say anything to deflect the truth, but the words wouldn't come. "Rachel," he said, his tone sharper now, "tell me it's not true." The weight of the lie was too much to bear. Tears filled my eyes as I whispered, "I'm sorry." The explosion of Greg's anger was immediate and devastating. He slammed his hand against the counter, his face contorted with rage and betrayal. "How could you?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the house. "How could you do this to me? To us? I didn't mean for it to happen," I said, my voice trembling. "It wasn't planned, Greg." Don't," he snapped, cutting me off. "Don't try to justify this. You've been sneaking around behind my back, lying to my face, and now you want to explain it away." "I'm sorry," I repeated, my tears falling freely now. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Hurt me?" He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You didn't just hurt me, Rachel. You destroyed us." The next morning, Luca was gone. Greg had demanded he leave immediately, his fury boiling over in every clipped word and tense movement. The silence that followed his departure was deafening. Emily wouldn't speak to me. Greg wouldn't even look at me, and I was left alone in the wreckage of what I had done, the weight of my choices crushing me from every angle. I wanted to believe that Luca and I had shared something real, something worth the pain and the consequences. But as I sat alone in the quiet house, the echoes of my family's broken trust ringing in my ears, I wasn't sure of anything anymore. The house felt like a tomb. Days passed, but the air remained heavy with unspoken words and simmering anger. Greg barely acknowledged my presence, moving through the house as if I didn't exist. Emily's cold silence was even harder to bear, her disappointment cutting deeper than any of Greg's words ever could. I couldn't blame them. I'd shattered the fragile foundation of our family, and now I was paying the price. I hadn't heard from Luca since Greg had demanded he leave. A part of me had hoped he'd fight to stay, that he'd call, text, something to show me I hadn't imagined the depth of our connection. But there was nothing, until a week later. It was a cold, overcast afternoon when my phone buzzed on the counter. I hesitated before picking it up, my breath catching when I saw Luca's name on the screen. "Luca, can we talk? Please, just once." I stared at the message, my heart pounding. I knew I should ignore it, that seeing him again would only make things worse. But the pull was too strong. "Me where?" His reply came quickly. "The park. By the fountain." I arrived at the park just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the dim light casting long shadows across the empty paths. Luca was already there, sitting on a bench by the fountain, his hands clasped in front of him. When he saw me, he stood, his expression a mixture of relief and sadness. "Rachel," he said, his voice soft but filled with emotion. I stopped a few feet away, my arms crossed protectively over my chest. "Why did you ask me to come here, Luca?" "I had to see you," he said, stepping closer. "I can't just disappear from your life without saying goodbye." The words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt tears prick at my eyes. "Goodbye." His face tightened with pain. "Greg made it clear I couldn't stay. And as much as I want to fight for you, I can't destroy your family any more than I already have." I shook my head, my throat tightening. "It's not your fault. This was my choice, Luca. I knew what I was risking, and I still—" "Because we couldn't stop," he interrupted, his voice raw. "Because what we had was real. Don't tell me it wasn't." I looked at him, my vision blurred with tears. "It was real," I whispered. "But it was also impossible." His shoulders sagged, and he took a step back, running a hand through his hair. "So, that's it? After everything, we're just done? What else can we do?" I asked, my voice breaking. "My family is falling apart, Luca." Emily barely looks at me. "Greg is furious. I can't." "Then come with me," he said suddenly, his voice desperate. The words hung between us, shocking in their simplicity. "Come with you," I repeated, disbelief laced in my tone. "Yes," he said, his eyes burning with determination. "Leave all of this behind. We can start over, Rachel. Together." For one fleeting moment, I imagined it. Running away with Luca, leaving the pain and betrayal behind. The thought was intoxicating, but it was quickly replaced by the crushing weight of reality. "I can't," I said, shaking my head. "I can't leave my children, Luca. I can't abandon them." He closed his eyes, the pain etched deeply into his face. "I love you, Rachel," he said, his voice breaking. "But I can't stay here and watch you suffer." Tears spilled down my cheeks as I took a step forward, cupping his face in my hands. "I love you too," I whispered, my voice trembling. "But this is where it has to end." His hands covered mine, his grip firm yet gentle. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the only sound the soft trickle of the fountain behind us. Finally, he leaned down, pressing a lingering kiss to my forehead. "Goodbye, Rachel," he murmured. "Goodbye, Luca," I replied, my heart breaking with every word. I watched him walk away, his figure fading into the twilight until he was gone. The emptiness that followed was unbearable, but I knew it was the only choice I could make. When I returned home, the house was dark. Greg was in the living room, a drink in his hand, staring at the muted glow of the television. He didn't look at me as I entered, his expression distant. "I saw him," I said, my voice barely audible. Greg's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. "It's over," I continued, tears streaming down my face. "It's done." He turned to me then, his eyes filled with anger and something deeper, something that looked like hurt. "It was over the moment it started, Rachel." His words were a knife to my chest, but I nodded, knowing he was right. I retreated to the bedroom, collapsing onto the bed as the weight of my choices crushed me. I had ended things with Luca, but the damage was done. The life I had known, the family I had built, would never be the same. The weeks after Luca's departure felt like an endless blur. The house remained steeped in a silence that was more oppressive than comforting. Conversations with Greg had dwindled to logistical exchanges about the kids or the bills. Emily avoided me entirely, her bedroom door shutting like a punctuation mark to our broken bond. I carried on, doing what needed to be done, but the weight of my choices pressed down on me at every moment. It was a cold Saturday morning when Greg finally broke the stalemate. I found him sitting at the kitchen table, a stack of papers spread out in front of him. He looked up as I entered, his face etched with exhaustion but also resolve. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but devoid of warmth. I hesitated, my heart sinking. I had been expecting this moment, dreading it, but now that it was here, I felt unprepared. Okay, I replied, sitting across from him. Greg pushed the papers toward me. I've been meeting with a lawyer. The words hit me like a blow, even though I had known they were coming. I glanced down at the papers, the legal jargon swimming before my eyes. Divorce? I murmured, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. Yes, Greg said firmly. I can't do this anymore, Rachel. I can't look at you without thinking about what you've done. I can't pretend things will ever go back to the way they were. Tears welled in my eyes, but I nodded. I understand. His jaw clenched, and for a moment, his composure wavered. I loved you, Rachel. I gave you everything I could. But it wasn't enough, was it? Greg, it wasn't about you, I said, my voice breaking. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was so lost. Lost? He repeated, his voice rising. So you decided to destroy our family to find yourself? I flinched, his words cutting deeper than I thought possible. I'm sorry, I whispered, the tears spilling over. I know I can't fix this. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. Greg stood abruptly, pacing the room. You're right. You don't. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant voices of the kids playing upstairs. Finally, Greg stopped and turned to me, his face a mixture of anger and sorrow. I'll move out next week, he said. We'll tell the kids together, but I'll give you some time to figure things out before we finalize anything. I nodded, unable to muster a response. Telling the kids was harder than I had imagined. Emily listened in stony silence, her expression unreadable. My son, too young to fully understand, simply asked if Dad would still be around to play catch. Greg reassured him that he would. His voice steady even as his eyes betrayed his pain. As the days passed, the house became a patchwork of absences. Greg's presence faded as he packed his things, and though the kids tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, the cracks in our family were impossible to ignore. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, the weight of everything pressing down on me. The house felt emptier than ever, every shadow a reminder of what I had lost. Luca's absence was a different kind of pain, quieter but no less sharp. I wondered where he was, what he was doing, if he thought about me as much as I thought about him. But I knew those thoughts were dangerous. Indulging them would only deepen the wounds that had already bled me dry. In the weeks that followed, I began to piece my life back together. I returned to teaching part-time, finding solace in the familiar rhythm of the classroom. It wasn't the same as it had been, but it was something, a small step toward reclaiming a sense of purpose. Emily remained distant, but there were moments when her icy demeanor thawed, when I saw glimpses of the bond we once shared. My son adjusted more easily, his world still anchored by his father's consistent presence. Greg and I communicated sparingly, our exchanges polite but hollow. The love we had once shared felt like a distant memory, replaced by a fragile truce built on shared responsibility. The divorce was finalized quietly, a signature on a dotted line marking the official end of our marriage. There was no dramatic confrontation, no tearful goodbyes, just a quiet acceptance of the life we had built and broken together. As I left the courthouse, the weight of the moment settled over me. I was free, but freedom came with a cost I hadn't fully anticipated. Months later, I sat in my garden, the spring blooms bursting with color around me. It was a rare moment of peace, the sun warm on my face as I sipped my coffee and reflected on everything that had led me here. I didn't regret Luca, though the pain of losing him lingered like a shadow. He had awakened something in me, a part of myself I had buried beneath years of routine and sacrifice. But I regretted the way I had hurt my family, the ripple effects of my choices that had left scars on the people I loved most. I had lost a marriage, a home, and a sense of stability. But I had also found something, an understanding of myself, of the parts of me that I needed to nurture, even in the face of uncertainty. Life, I realized, was messy and imperfect. And though the path I had taken was riddled with mistakes, it was mine to walk. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.